you today to a very interesting talk, rather a conversation with Bette on her book, The Secret Life of Mullah Omar. Now, for those of you that follow the region, and particularly Afghanistan, I'm sure you're all aware of Ms. Bette, and I won't spend too much time on her introduction because I want to spend the next hour or so having a conversation with her where she'll give us her perspective on the book and the recent work that she's doing. I want it to be more interactive, and I want everybody to participate and take advantage of the session that we have with Bette. But just to follow Norm, I do have to say a couple of words about her. So Ms. Bette is also the author of A Man and a Motorcycle, How Hamid Karzai Came to Power, and she has also authored Looking for the Enemy, which is the first Western biography written on Mullah Omar. Now, Bette, just for your knowledge, we are joined by eminent scholars, policy experts, diplomats, and academics for this conversation, including some of our ambassadors that served in Afghanistan or have been working on Afghanistan. So I look forward to this hopefully exciting discussion. Before I hand over the floor to you, I would like Ambassador Sohail Mahmood to make his remarks.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you so much, Samna. A very warm welcome to everybody and to our distinguished speaker today. Ms. Bette is a very eminent journalist and also focusing mostly on conflict areas, including Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. But today, the subject of her event and conversation today is the book that she authored on the life of Mullah Omar. We all know, a very central figure of the Taliban movement. And the book sheds light on various aspects of the Taliban movement, its origins, its rise in a very peculiar historical context of Afghanistan, and then the military conquest, the governance style of the Taliban movement and of Mullah Omar himself, then arrival of the Al-Qaeda and the relationship between the Taliban leadership and Osama bin Laden, the 9/11, its aftermath, and then the last years of Mullah Omar, including his demise. In traversing this journey, Ms. Bette has busted many of the myths that were created by interested quarters and accepted uncritically by the media, primarily Western media, and then popularized. So I think we can look forward to a very interesting perspective on the origin of the movement, its role in the Afghan history, recent history, and also how issues framed in Washington and elsewhere made a particular caricature of the phenomenon that emerged in a very peculiar. As one of the observers has said, that this is a story told on Afghan terms and in Afghan context itself also. We're very delighted to have a very distinguished presence of people who have very deep knowledge of Afghanistan as well. We have several ambassadors, and we have former Foreign Secretary also who has authored 2 books on Afghanistan also. And then we have academics, we have practitioners, and we have students as well. So very warm welcome to everybody, and then without further ado, I will let Ms. Amna to start the conversation from which I am sure everybody will benefit. Thank you so much.
You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Yeah, nice to talk in Islamabad about this topic with an interesting audience, a mixed audience, which is always important. So I will take you into my life as this investigative journalist who worked on this book for 5 years, and it's how how I ended up doing this and why. And I also will take you a little bit into my new project, which is basically a consequence of the Omar book, and that is in the shape of a PhD on journalism. Because after writing the Omar book, I left Afghanistan with a great concern about the country, but as much also with a great concern about Western journalism, in particular American journalism. So that's what we are going to do. I'm not. It's not a one-way road. You can always interrupt me. I have some sheets just to make it a bit more clear and shorter, probably. But just interrupt me whenever you want. So this is the book. And I wanted to start with the master narrative, as they call it in academia, which has been for 20 years, and it's still alive, the so-called war on terror. And this war on terror came with a lot of assumptions about the region, and it came with a lot of assumption about Afghanistan. And this was driven by the US government. That set the agenda, obviously, after the Twin Towers exploded, were attacked and imploded. For me, I was 22, I think, at the time, at 9/11. This was also my reality. I lived mostly on the Western side of the world. I also read mostly Western media. The New York Times was the most important source. I was very proud to have even a subscription to the New York Times. That means I belong to the elite who basically can join the international debate on Afghanistan. And of course, as a journalist, I wanted to keep up to date, and to me, that was the best source to do so. So, as you can see, the war on terror was headlines of again and again attacks by the Taliban. The idea of us, the Netherlands, 95% of the journalists only went embedded to this country, to Afghanistan. So I grew up, or I was living in that narrative of bases, and we had to understand ISAF very well, NATO. That was the assignment, to understand the international mission, not so much the Afghan story. To survive in these big camps, as you can see here, the one is Kandahar, 2006. I don't know how many people there were, maybe 15,000 soldiers. It was a city that you had to survive as a very young journalist. It's very intimidating also, the military, especially when you come in new. It was my second war, but still I was super young and new and unexperienced. Anyhow, I went embedded. That was my first connection with Afghanistan, and that also changed my perspective quite quickly. I felt there was a lack of knowledge at the NATO camps, and there was a lot of fear. I imagined that they would be more in control, but they were very reactive instead of proactive. I was stunned by the lack of Afghan voices on these camps. The Afghan voices were basically lined up at the gate, and only were allowed in now and then to talk. This was for me very unsatisfying, and I decided to either never come back to this region or in a different shape. And I came back as a potential author of the first book on Hamid Karzai, because that was this fascinating period after 9/11 where he took power. And I wanted to know how that went. How did he manage that? And there were a couple of American books with loud American narratives about how American army was super successful in launching Hamid Karzai as a president. But I think elevating the Afghan voices, which I did, made the story different, much more nuanced, and much more agency on the Afghan side as well, including Hamid Karzai himself. So what I noticed when I went on my own, is that the war on terror basically closed off this region. It looked to us like an impossible to go here. It was monstrous. You would never fly alone to Kabul, and for me it was a very big, pleasant surprise that it was actually possible, that this was a fantasy, basically, especially in 2007, 8, and 9. We could go, the point of access was a different reality in Afghanistan than what we communicated, simply also because we, as press, focus on violence. We basically portrayed the country through that lens. I will come to that. Now, when I finished the Karzai, so the Karzai book had one very important message, and that was that overall, in the 20 years of war, or I published this in 2009, what was very clear from the interviews with Afghans, and mainly with the elite around Karzai, and Karzai himself, is that the attacks that were reported as Taliban, or sometimes they made Taliban Al-Qaeda out of it, they were a bit, that didn't really matter, they lumped it together. It was actually a whole different reality. The ideological idea that there was a terroristic threat in Afghanistan was very difficult to find. What I did find by interviewing even the people who attacked were governors who had became Superman, who had all the weapons and the money of the US government to chase the terrorists. And by offering this to the governors, there was no eye for the personal history of the governors, or policemen, or other influential tribal leaders the Americans allied up with. And so what really pushed and pulled attacks was tribalism, tribal conflicts between the winner governor, who had a rivalry with the Tarbur in another valley, who was framed towards the US government as a Taliban. And the US government lacked often proper cross-checking, trigger-happy, paying even for information to find Taliban. $10,000 was an amount that was transferred to these governors who were very poor at that time. So that is the outcome of the book on Karzai. There was a misunderstanding of who was the enemy by now. Who was the enemy in 2009, actually? And how strong was the Taliban? At the same time, we were still living in this world where the Taliban was a huge mystery. There were not a lot of interviews with the Taliban. And there was in Kabul, there was also a very strong idea that you shouldn't talk to them, especially under American journalists. They were so much aligned with this idea that the enemy of the US government had become their enemy, which I found absolutely shocking from a journalistic perspective. I think you have to keep on talking to all sides of the story if you're a journalist. You don't belong to anyone. And that was a big lesson for me. So I saw there was a soccer field of information that was not reached out to, not talked to, that it was just there. And I had seen through Karzai, his network, that they were talking to the Taliban. They had all personal connections in Kandahar and Helmand. They were having deals together. They were visiting each other. So for me, the step to do the book on Mullah Omar was not so big anymore. Because I could literally ask Karzai, give me the telephone number of this and this and this man, because I know you were talking to them, and he would do that. There was no problem. So, yeah, that's how I thought it's super important to also portray the enemy, who I wouldn't call it the enemy. I mean, it's the enemy of the United States, and it's the enemy of others, but it's for me a group that had to be portrayed, that had to be interviewed on a daily basis, as much as we interviewed the Afghan government or the US government. Now, so in my book, I describe this. I describe this from my personal perspective, leaving the Netherlands and in the end moving to Kabul, living there and diving into this topic as responsible as possible, where in the end the Omar book is very much about Mullah Omar. You get to know him, you go with him to school, you go with him to a madrasa system, for example, in Uruzgan that I had no idea about, a Hujra system. That when I came back to Kabul, many people had said, what, does that exist? And there were plenty of these very small madrasas where the Taliban had been reading books minimally, but had been educated in a certain way that had nothing to do with politics or anti-Western sentiment, for example. So you go with him to his schools, to this Hujra system, and then you go with him to the jihad, of course. You join him in the choices he makes at that point. He's moving, he's leaving Uruzgan, he is lining up with a couple of friends who basically continue to be his friends until the moment they take over. Mullah brother is one of them. And then I describe how he came to power in 1994, where we have another narrative that is pushed as if Pakistan has been the sole creator of this weirdo movement that came up, fell from the sky, and that has been positioned in Kandahar. And from then on, Pakistan was deciding on what the Taliban would do and would not do. I nuanced this on several levels. I think the understanding that in the US, in Washington, D.C., that Pakistan has so much influence on the Taliban hurts understanding what is going on here. And I think that obstructs progress. I think you have to be much more nuanced in that towards this country. Also, yeah, anyhow. So that is an important part, and then we also see policy making, of course, of the Taliban. It's very much alike now. There's a lot of similarities in what is happening right now and what were the choices in 1995 and 1996 when they took over the country. A topic that is not present right now, but was, of course, at that time was Osama bin Laden. That has also an image in the West. There's a narrative created in the West of a very close relationship between Mullah Omar and Osama bin Laden, and that sort of suggested that you have to be at Mullah Omar's office to get Osama bin Laden out of the country. I go in very much in detail into this relationship that was very different. It was a very problematic relationship. Something that was out in the open, which was very disappointing again towards the journalism. Like if you look at the BBC right now, the Mullah Omar and Osama bin Laden are still fishing together in a lake that doesn't exist in Kandahar, for example. And that's only like a little anecdote for like a very important topic where you have basically legitimization for the war, saying Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are very good friends. And they are building on an anti-Western strategy in this region. And for that, our military are allowed to be here. It's fascinating that this basically is untrue. I mean, there was a lot of will in the Taliban to get Osama bin Laden out. In the end, I described this how Mullah Omar in the end becomes stubborn for many reasons. He doesn't want Osama bin Laden, but he also definitely doesn't want to please the Americans anymore. And that's, I think, the important red line in Mullah Omar's political history of 1994 till 2001. He started off with welcoming the American ambassador to Kandahar. He's like, when are you going to open the office in Kabul? Because we have fought the jihad for you. You have given us weapons, thank you again for that. We won. The communists are gone. You wanted an Islamic state. I will do the job for you. open your embassy, we become friends. Because we were friends. And and that didn't really go as Mullah Omar expected. Mullah Omar was also, of course, very unexperienced. I mean, he has been only to Kabul 2 times, as far as I know, maybe 3 times. So his worldview has to be understood at that time, also by the American embassy. Who was this man? Can we even relate to that? And then the cables that leaked out of Islamabad, of the US embassy because of WikiLeaks and whatnot, there's a lot of information that can help you understand how arrogant the Americans were towards Mullah Omar. I spent a lot of time talking about how Mullah Omar, from his Taliban perspective, wished, not always realistically, but wished to have Osama bin Laden in a courthouse in Kabul. Bring him to the court. If he is a terrorist, let our Sharia do its job. Now, you can brush this aside and say this is a delay tactic. The Americans did that. You can read that in the cables. But talking to the Taliban and talking to people, of course, around him and people who were involved in this court case, gathering out of evidence about Osama bin Laden, his past, in the Khobar Tower attacks, and all the things that would add to the idea that he is this international terrorist, is fascinating. And there's a lot to learn from the Taliban side on how they have been dealing with this. Now, in the end, as the last attempt of Mullah Omar, which is public knowledge, to get Osama bin Laden out of the country is in the summer of 2001, when he tries to send him to Doha. And then there would be an Islamic court who would look at the evidence from the US. And US, rightly so, I think, is legally not allowed to carry the evidence to a 3rd country. At the same time, the US was also not illegally ready to get Osama bin Laden on their territory. So Osama bin Laden was home, like a total, very difficult for the Taliban to get a legal way out of this as well. Then another idea with the Americans is that, and with the Western world for that matter, is that because Osama bin Laden was not delivered, the American government made the conclusion that if somebody does not deliver the person we request him to deliver, they are friends. Very strong idea in Washington, D.C. That means, because they are friends, they have been contemplating 9/11 together. That means that the Taliban is also guilty of 9/11. Those 4 steps are, if you do a proper cross-check, fall apart. The fact that Osama bin Laden was not delivered was because of a political stubbornness, because of the between the US and Mullah Omar, almost personally in the end. 90% of the Taliban wanted to get rid of this guy, this arrogant Arab. Fuck off, basically. But there was a very small group who said no, Mullah Omar included. Then there was the idea that Mullah Omar and Osama bin Laden were meeting a lot. You can cross that easily. You can cross-check that. Osama bin Laden, his son, is available in Doha. He sits there ready to give interviews about the relationship of his father with Mullah Omar, which I did talk to him extensively. And there was no information sharing of Osama bin Laden. It was the other way around. Osama bin Laden was afraid the Taliban would figure this out. The Taliban were not on the side of Osama bin Laden. They were afraid that some Taliban did go to the US embassy in August 2001, saying there's something wrong here. You have to help. So when 9/11 happened, and the US Army, the US government was of course in this extremely, and that's often how war started, extremely emotional whirlwind. Like, that's even an understatement, right? For the first time, the US was attacked on their own soil. It's very difficult, as we can see in the book, for journalists to stay calm in these situations. the opposite happened. The New York Times, in the front line, became patriotistic, ran after the US government war on terror, which was launched instantly, with all the concept that I just tried to nuance or sometimes debunk. So that comes to Afghanistan, this storm comes to Afghanistan and says, we need you to expel Osama bin Laden, but they requested for a whole lot more. This was not only Osama bin Laden's. Mullah Omar was never convinced to do that in that 1 month. So the war starts, you have American troops together with the Brits entering Afghanistan, and the US government says, wow, look, this is going very fast. In the 5th or 6th of December, only Kandahar was still standing. It was a blitzkrieg, success achieved. Now, what is not reported is a very important concept of Afghanistan, is talking to each other. Many groups and families and tribes and tarbus and whatnot try to find each other. Sometimes by literally meeting through the chaos of the war, meeting each other, or by writing letters. There were a lot of letters floating around. And many letters went to Karzai, or Ahmed Wali Karzai in Quetta. Who can, and those were letters of surrender. Those were letters of Taliban who were known to the Karzais or informally known, or they needed to reassign their future. And that is also hopeful. That's also, it is pragmatic and hopeful, because many of the provinces of the Taliban were trying to reach out to this new leadership that would become Hamid Karzai. And that comes to an end, and that is something extremely important to understand the history of Afghanistan, recent history of Afghanistan. And I wish we would have all together a chance to rewrite it. But that comes to an end on December 6th, when this whole connections between each other leaves the core leadership of the Taliban in a house, in a basement in the center of Kandahar, with Mullah Omar present, where Mullah Omar gives the authority to Ubaidullah, says, I am out, but the group I interviewed them had requested for a surrender. Give up, Mullah Omar. Mullah brother wanted to give up much earlier. Mullah brother wanted to deliver Osama bin Laden. But anyhow, we are there, December 5th, where Mullah Omar said, okay, I will give up. And I will give my authority to Mullah Ubaidullah, and he will talk to Karzai. Karzai was ready in Shavalikot, just 2 hours, I think, 3 hours, bad roads, but from the city. And that is a historical moment where Karzai, with his connections and the Taliban leadership, find each other and lay the ground for a potential inclusiveness that was so hoped for later on. We don't know. The Americans sometimes respond to this particular story of like, how can you say this in hindsight? It would have gone nowhere anyway. I find it very colonial to say. I think that's underestimating also the potential of after 9/11, the hope there was, the will to change. There was a lot of positivism at that time. And then we see a radical change. Instead of the sort of getting closer to each other, and not every Taliban did that, but there was a substantial amount of influential leaders who wanted to either go home or be part of the new construction under the leadership of Hamid Karzai. So, and that is, and then the last part I will talk a little bit about this media research that I do now. What you see is basically 24 hours only where the surrender is announced in these newspapers. So The Guardian, and where there is Karzai who asked, I think he called AP or he called the BBC saying they surrendered, there's amnesty, the war will end, something like that. And then within a couple of hours, Washington wakes up. And then Rumsfeld did have a daily press briefing. And so the press came to him that day. And there was a question asked, do you accept the surrender of the Taliban? And then he says, there's nothing happening against our will. And from that moment on, the surrender is killed. Doesn't exist in America. And it is, in American narrative, it disappears. Now, this is what the US government can do. It's not the first time that the US government is obstructing peace in its history. What is a much bigger problem to me is that this story of connection, of potential peace, also disappeared from newspapers like the New York Times or Associated Press or the press release, the press agencies. So what did we get? We basically have a country without an enemy. And we have a perception in Washington, D.C. to double the troops as soon as possible. What do you get if you send troops to a country where there is no enemy? That is what I found out in this Karzai book. This is chaos. This is total chaos. You line up with your allies, you tap them on the shoulder. You have no eye for their history. You have no eye for the long, also, war history in a family-oriented society where they rely mostly on tribes or sub-tribes to survive because there's simply no government. And this is what, if you want to talk about the Afghan conflict, this is what the conflict is. It's not a war on terror. It's not. It's a very misconception of the conflict, the attacks that we saw happening. The attacks were political, economical, social, tribal. Nothing to do with ideological anti-Western sentiment in Afghanistan. These people, three people are very big examples of the profiteers of American intervention. And they received a lot of money. First is the governor of Uruzgan, Jah Mohammed Khan. Second is Assadullah Khalid, who was a big spoiler, who the Americans saw as a good fighter, as the one who could kill the Taliban. But in the meantime, Assadullah Khalid was killing private enemies left and right. The same for Assadullah Khalid, Abdul Razik. So we have first a suppressed narrative of a peace, negotiations, outreach, amnesty, connectiveness between the former regime and the new regime that disappears from the media. And then we have the second one here, which I call false reporting or denunciation, where you have a conflictuous situation on the ground where there's a complete misunderstanding of what's actually happening. Well, I won't go into this. This is academia. What is very important to understand for conflicts, and maybe many of you try to follow other conflicts, and I'm trying also in Paris at Sciences Po to link the power of media to political science. These people have to talk, because understanding that, for example, AP, Reuters and AFP dominate still the stream of information that we wake up with in the morning. It's very important to understand how wide these organizations are. 80% of the stories, of the information in the world comes from them. They are Western organizations. They prioritize the Western source over the Global South source. That has a huge impact on how we continue to stereotype, otherize, and also, in a sense, legitimize conflict by selecting, as you can see here, topics that are negative. We focus on corruption. We focus on violence. Now, as I say here, I think we have to connect these two worlds. You have to understand, if you live in Washington or Berlin or Brussels, D.C., or Brussels, sorry, you see the world through a frame that is this powerful media. And so yeah, that is now my new project to bring that a little bit to the table. I will be finished almost. So then we open up the table. So here we did a New York Times coverage. We analyzed all the articles they published on the 20 years of war, because after finishing this Omar book, I was like, whoa! I mean, how can we legitimize and wake up as press with knowing that such an outreach and such a potential for peace is completely denied? I find it super fascinating. I think also it really screams for a debate in how journalists evaluate the coverage on Afghanistan, and probably Ukraine as well. Here we see, for example, when did the New York Times publish? The New York Times publishes when there were more troops, and it goes down when there are less troops. Can you see that here? Yeah. Also, when we see there is American deaths, there is more attention in the American media. When we look at the last graph, there's like the Afghans who die is getting more and more and more, and there is the attention of the New York Times goes down. It's fascinating, I think. The only time we have found a proper attention for the surrender in 2001 is this article. Did the war in Afghanistan have to happen? Question mark. To me, that question mark is unnecessary, because there's enough research in the suppressed areas, in minority narratives that are still in the sort of dead corner of our debate where they shouldn't be. And this article, did the war in Afghanistan have to happen, ends with no, it was not necessary to happen. And this article was written after the Taliban returned to Kabul in August 2001. That was my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. That has been fascinating. I will reserve my comments and open the floor because I know there's a lot of interest. Yes, we'll start with Dr. Shabana.
Good morning, everybody. What a really a pleasure to see you. Finally, we have been reading about you and always wanted to see you and meet you, and today is the day. Very pronounced analysis that you have done. This is analysis actually that has been carried out by the researchers from our side of the world.
Yeah.
But since it never came out from the Western side, so the legitimacy or the broader exposure was never given. We have been going to the international conferences, and whenever we speak this narrative, myself has worked on the war on terror, it was seen as a opinionated work. It was seen as something not a reality. But it's really good and refreshing to see so many works now coming out. I want to have 3 queries. You have written a book on the Mullah Omar. So, and you have also said that the Karzai and others, they were in fact not in direct contact, but they know one another. So the first query that comes to mind is that did you happen to have a face-to-face conversation with Mullah Omar?
Never.
Never. Okay. So the second question is that what were the sources? Can you really rely on the Karzai and the other sympathetic leaders who were towards the peace and wanted to have a dialogue to say that that's what Mullah Omar really wanted? And second question is the logistics and the weapons. Since you lived there, who was supporting whom? I would like to have reflection on that.
Yeah, so I think maybe the journalistic solution to a question when you cannot speak to the main person is to talk around them. And I was surprised to see that there's so many witnesses were alive, like the teachers in Uruzgan, the neighbors, the drivers, the doctor, the dentist, secretaries, ministers from that time. So I think it's to you to judge if you are convinced by the sourcing. I think I put a little bit of an effort to have footnotes and have a clear and be transparent on that. But yeah, there's so much that's all I can do to convince you. You can still, yeah. The last question, weapons. What do you mean? Yeah. I mean, when after 2005 the Taliban came into being, different from the story of the Taliban who would hide in the mountains in 2002 and immediately become an insurgency. That started much later. But then, 2005, the Taliban had an endless reservoir of fighters to select from. There were a lot of angry families running away from these governors and seeking revenge. And the Taliban was one source to go to. And yes, the Taliban is now known. There was support. There's weapon support from the Emirates. I mean, it's not my specialty, but it became a full-blown insurgency. Yeah. Please.
Thank you, Mina. Spectacular. That's great. I find myself at a disadvantage.
Okay.
Because I haven't read your book yet.
Okay.
But I'm going to get it and maybe have it signed by you.
No
Okay?
problem.
Yes, I think you've said a lot of things today which axiomatically many of us have been feeling about anyway in the past. It's nice to see that in print and coming from Western media even better. I liked your mistake which you made along the way, Washington and Brussels, DC.
Yeah.
I think that should be the title of your next book. It is? Is it really?
No, it's not my title, but I will consider it, yeah.
My questions and comments. Mullah Omar and today, after the hasty withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan, chaos, we know all about it. There was a very major effort amongst the government which existed at that time, the Taliban coming back, to project Taliban as a Taliban 2.0, liberal and one which wants to engage with the world. Now, that didn't quite happen that way. But the question which is embedded in my comments here is, why? On one side, I think very clearly, because of the humanitarian crisis and the lack of response from the West and international response to really help out, except for a few efforts, I think there must have been great disenchantment within Afghanistan. And that kind of disenchantment always strengthens the hand of the hardliners. Because, look, nobody is helping us at a time of need. Why should we bow down to what is really required?
Yeah.
And therefore, issues like the women crisis, which was given, I mean, I don't want to minimize this in any way, which was given more emphasis in the press than the humanitarian crisis and any help, concrete help which came forward. Then obviously you had, well, forget about going into a new thing, we are going back to the old. And I could see that kind of thing happening. Now, simple question on that is my analysis anywhere near correct or not? And I'm not an expert in this area. I'm, by the way, a former World Bank director of operations, actually, global operations, now retired. My second, which actually relates to the first, is the whole question of the amount of money owed, which had been invested in US banks by the Afghan government, which has not been returned. And on the excuse, and I asked this to my current World Bank people who are in charge, and I said, why is the World Bank not pushing this thing? And they say, well, unless the country is recognized, we don't have a mechanism in which to supply the funds. Now, this is a circular argument to my case. First of all, the United States goes around the world saying, don't recognize it. Now, many countries are complicit in this. I'm not saying it's US alone. But there's a circular argument. Don't recognize it. It's not recognized, so we can't give the money. And what's more, we give it to 9/11 victims. So, is there any chance that this will ever come back? Is the Taliban government now doing anything about it in this hour of need? So these are my two sort of general comments and questions, and I'd love your insight on this. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit hesitant to jump in current affairs because I am not in the country. And I learned that doing journalism is in general, it's important to be close to your sources. I find the financial, the bank situation and the amount of money difficult. Maybe Amina goes much more to Afghanistan right now than I do. I don't want to push you in, but I mean, I don't have a good answer for you. There are others who can do that. I think what is interesting, I was here 1.5 months ago, I think 2 months ago, and then I was out of curiosity talking to the main players, like Americans, Norwegians, the Taliban, about this radicalization on specifically the girls' education. And I think it would be good in the reporting to, of course, narrow the situation of the girls' education is the situation which we have to describe. You have to describe why, what are the incentives, and so on. But really also include us as the West. We have played a role in this. And there's a lot of reflection now, I feel, in Islamabad about what did we do after the fall. We were, again, a little bit like before 9/11, very hesitant to say anything positive about the Taliban. Journalists have seen pieces that have been talking, for example, on a better economy, or really struggled with their editors back home to keep that in the text. That is understandable. It's the emotion that is still very much alive in the West, but it doesn't help journalism. And I think interviewing Balkhi for the 100th times about why there is no girls' education, you can do that. I mean, I don't think he's going to move, but go also to the American embassy, try to understand how they feel. And go to the Norwegian, how they feel. How do they reflect on the fact that the girls' schools were closed suddenly in March last year? What happened? And did we have a role? Did we play a role as the West? I say we because I'm from there. And I think that story should be much more also include the West. There's a lot of lack of self-reflection on that. We basically, I see it like this. When the fall happened, it was a very emotional moment for many of us, I think. And it was just, for me, very difficult to see that, you know, I teach at Sciences Po. If I make 20 years long mistakes at Sciences Po, yeah, and my reviews are going down and down, the student, how long would I stay at Sciences Po? Not long, I can tell you that. And that feeling came up when Kabul fell, and all these diplomats on the Western side who have the money and who have the knowledge and who have the freedom to think about the other and to think responsibly about what to do and to allow self-reflection if you are strong enough. And these people would just continue. I saw them a week later in conferences in Brussels. And I was like, oh my God, but what am I going to expect from you now? What did you do? What is your level of understanding? How dangerous is this? I don't know if you agree, but I just thought we need a whole new set of people with really knowledge and with really understanding and maybe a little bit of empathy towards the situation, not the feeling of revenge. The Americans are handcuffed. The Americans are handcuffed by Washington, D.C. to search for any nuance. That's not what Afghanistan needs. Girls' education needs knowledge and understanding and empathy. And only with that, there's a small opening, because a very small opening right now.
Ambassador Riaz? No, please.
Thank you for asking me. Thank you, Madame Bette. Unfortunately, I have some problem with my hearing, so I couldn't follow the talk that you have given. My own connection with Afghanistan is now old and stale, probably. But as I see, Afghanistan no longer attracts attention from the outside world. Even for Pakistan, I think the current situation is something that we can live with. And it has much to do with the situation in Afghanistan, Pakistan itself, and also that we have had an experience of 40 years in which there used to be ambitions, but now I think any sensible person in Pakistan would not nurse any ambition vis-a-vis Afghanistan. So that is one point that I would make now that you have asked me. Secondly, Mullah Omar and the kind of political dispensation which is there in Afghanistan today, I am not very focused on it, to tell you frankly. How will it sort of evolve over a period of time? I don't see any definitive directions, except that how long can Afghanistan as a society resist the pressures of modernization which is occurring all around? And that applies to Pakistan, and that also would apply, if not now, in few years to come, to Afghanistan as well. So these are some of my very stray comments on the Afghanistan situation, but as I mentioned to you that it's long ago that I used to be much more focused on Afghanistan. I wrote 2 books on that, but the last one was in 2008, which is quite a long time ago. But if you can throw some light as to how you think the Afghan situation may evolve in the future. Mullah Omar, yes, he was a personality, a kind of ascetic personality, Islamist in a way, but he is not a trendsetter, in my view. He is not the one who has, in a way, fixed the direction of Afghanistan and Afghan society. But I may be wrong, because societies can live in this kind of situation for a generation, almost. The one factor that one finds is that the educated Afghans, they have either left Afghanistan, or those who are there in Kabul and other urban centers. Why, personally, I do not know how are they thinking, what do they think ought to be Afghanistan like, what should be the governance, what should be the society. So if you can throw some light, I'll be grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit careful because I haven't been reporting on it. So, but I mean, I think I don't know if the Afghan civilian has much to say at the moment with the Taliban in power. It's not a democratic elected, for example, or in any other shape, representing and in dialogue so much with the citizens. I do think that overall, as anybody in the world, there is a group in the south, there is a group in the villages that has, from the tribal perspective, not so much from the Islamic perspective, but from the old traditions, a problem and find it scary to send their girl out of their house. And there's many. it is a danger to them because there is no really proper buildings for the school. They don't understand the curriculum, what will be told to these girls, who is going to be the teacher. We have been through this before, after communism. The Taliban had, so that there is a large group of men who have of fathers or grandfathers who are very careful with that. I mean, also before before the fall. It's also because they rely, for income, they rely on that family structure. It's their only thing. There is no insurance. There's no good justice at the moment, and there was not before. So that creates a lot of insecurities, and so the tribe or the sub-tribe or this extended family needs to survive, and the honor is easily hurt. So you have to operate carefully, and the role of women in that sense is something that is a whole different world than where I am from. That exists. Now, what are these men going to do if there is a proper schooling system, if there is transparency on the curriculum, if there is a knowledge about the teachers? Will they send the girls? Yeah, a part of them will. In Kabul is the big city, but we also see conservatism in Kabul. There's also families, very much family-oriented and protective towards their female and their daughters. Anyhow, I overall think that, and as any citizen, there is an interest to have a good life, to have an economy that works, and to have the freedom to do what you want to do with the girls, and not to let this directed by this current regime. And that can lean towards conservatism for certain parts in the country, and other parts that not. But I think that is a sort of brief answer to yeah.
About the role of women, I'll just narrate one anecdote, my personal. I had given a talk somewhere. When I came out, there were about 4 or 5 Taliban type students. They approached me and they said that what you have said about women, etc., that is not in accordance with Islam. So I said, all right, I'll answer your question if you answer one question from me. And I said, tell me, who is the first lady of Islam? Now they were completely at a loss, because in the madaris, they are not taught about Hazrat Khatija. So when I told them that it is Hazrat Khatija, and that she was a businesswoman, she was a literate woman, that she defended the Holy Prophet, and there are so many things. She used to interact with the Sardars of Mecca. So I said, your role model in Islam for a woman should be her, rather than what kind of ideas you have. So the Afghans, the Taliban, they may say anything about their claim that they are a model Islamic society. They are not, absolutely not.
No, I think that is not only the Taliban. I think the understanding of their system, calling it Islam, is, of course, they have the freedom to do that. I mean, and they do lump together a tribal history, a Pashtunwali history, with an Islam, but they see it as Islam. Yeah.
Well, it's just a brief question. You have written somewhere, perhaps in this book or elsewhere, that Mullah Omar died in Zabul.
Oh, yeah.
And that before his death, he was living in the vicinity of the US base. You must have heard it from some Afghan sources, but can you give us some details?
What details do you like to know?
Number one, that you confirm this? And
It's in
number
my
two,
book,
if there are any other details available.
I wrote everything in the book. So that is the story of like what happened after the surrender. Where did Mullah Omar go? To Zabul, together with a lot of Taliban. Not only him. Yeah, and then where did he then, like a lot of Taliban left for Pakistan, and Mullah Omar did not. Yeah, that is the version I come with. And I am I'm waiting for more detailed reporting. There is one witness still alive who's not interviewed, for example. Maybe he will tweak the story, I don't know. But I'm quite transparent on the sources, and I would highly suggest to read it and really look at who is talking. And then you can make up your mind. I know it's controversial. I know there was quite some pushback from the Afghan government. And I also invited the people like Amrullah Saleh to come up and show their story and source it well. And that I didn't see so far.
First of all, thank you for a very informative session. You mentioned...
Introduce yourself, please. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm political advisor for Afghanistan at the Norwegian Embassy. First of all, I want to make a comment, and then there's a question, right? When you very clearly talked about how the US invasion and intervention in Afghanistan, they were external to the Afghan society, and that disturbed the social contract within the Afghan society. But it's only a comment. But we also need to go a bit deeper into it, and also we also need to see how the Talibanization process or how the Taliban themselves are external or were external to the Afghan society. Because as you mentioned, that Afghan society is a very tribal sort of society, which different tribes used to live in a very decentralized sort of setup within the geography of Afghanistan. While the Taliban themselves, they want to centralize the society as per the rules of Islam, right? So we need also to see how the Taliban or Talibanization process itself is external to the Afghan society as well. It was only a comment. The question is you talked about the similarities between the present form of policy making within the Taliban and the policy making during the Mullah Omar era. I mean to say, you want to make a comparison between the currently the supreme leader of the Taliban, Haibatullah, and Mullah Omar decision making process. And I think you think that there may be certain similarities between them. But at the same time, we see that now currently for the Taliban 3.0, which they say that the objective conditions are a bit different. For example, at the time of Mullah Omar, there was no sort of internal conflicts or internal sort of differences within the Taliban itself. Currently, we can see that Haibatullah is, for example, facing, or Haibatullah needs to deal with the cabinet within the Kabul, which was not there at that time when we were talking about Taliban 1.0. So, do you think, the question is, do you think that Haibatullah Akhundzada will be able to make or to draw a sort of, to create a sort of leadership which Mullah Omar used to have, or the way Mullah Omar had centralized the Taliban, in the same way, do you think Haibatullah Akhundzada will be able to do that?
I think I think there's a tactic Haibatullah is using now in relation to the girls' education, probably, but this is a bit far away guessing. I told you I haven't been there. But I see for example, of course, the way he lives. He tries to be very unapproachable, he tries to imitate these things that worked so well for Mullah Omar, that mystified him among the leadership. Though he met a lot of people. Mullah Omar met a lot of people internally, and Haibatullah does as well. But outsiders is a bit more difficult. But you can see that too. I don't need to tell you that. So I think that the internal differences were there before 9/11. The Mullah Omar had lost his power 2 times almost. I didn't know. It's an interesting part of history. I didn't know. He was almost shuffled out of the governor's compound by tribes once, by tribal conflict. Anyhow, I think the Haqqani role is different. The Haqqanis have benefited from the war, and not before 9/11. The Haqqanis were more or less at arm's length of Mullah Omar and left in the east and had their own dynamics, also in relationship with Islamabad. Now that's different. I think that there was not a very good fluent relationship between Haqqanis and Mullah Omar before 9/11. Literally also geographically they are far apart. There are not a lot of intermarriages, so they also don't really know each other. They really have a different dynamic, different tribe system. But now the Haqqanis are more prominent, which is fascinating to observe from afar. How they deal with each other, how they now get to know each other. Of course, they've got to know each other when they were in insurgency. Yeah, also because I got to know the Haqqanis in the East before 9/11 as the ones who got allowed girls' education. The girls' schools were rather flexible on that. Also, the Haqqanis I got to know surrendered as well in 2001. Until the moment Pacha Khan Sadran blocked that, because Pacha Khan Sadran had better connection with the US Army and the Special Forces and convinced them to bomb the convoy of the Haqqanis going to Karzai to surrender. So, yeah, there's a lot of repetition, and I think there's a lot to learn from Mullah Omar's style and how he governed. If you really, not to promote my book, I don't want that, but I think there's quite some insightful parts in that that can be super useful now. Yeah.
Well, I'll ask 2 questions. One is what my colleague said about your discovery of Mullah Omar to have died just under the nose of the American in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
My question is that how come that a superpower sitting in that country is not aware of his whereabouts?
Yeah.
And even the whole world is missing on a person who is in the eyes of everybody. Then when he dies, you discover. So we would need a little more solid proof of what you said. Otherwise, I have heard from very respectable Afghans, very well-informed Afghans, who still claim that he died in Karachi in a hospital and then was taken to Afghanistan. And the second question is that about Osama bin Laden.
Mm-hmm.
Have you come across any solid proof of the American that he was really involved in what the American accused him of? Because I'll just tell you something that I know about. Before the 9/11, when Americans were trying their level best to get hold of Osama through peaceful means, the Taliban the Taliban made a condition that, look, if you have a solid proof of his involvement, we will certainly hand him over to you. But we have not yet come across of any from your side. Then they proposed that, okay, let's do it this way. Osama is a Saudi Arab national. Pakistan is a very dear friend of us. So our proposal is that 3 Islamic countries of the OIC including Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and a third Muslim country, should sit on this particular issue and make a decision. If they find him guilty, we will exactly do whatever they recommend. Because then I agree with you, Mullah Omar, to get rid of Osama, but was scared or afraid of the backlash at home, so he wanted a proper political cover.
Yeah.
The American didn't agree to that proposal. They said, no, nothing doing. You have to hand him over to us or take him to a country where from we can pick him up. Don't you think it is, or the fault lies with America and not with Osama bin Laden, because they have till today, as far I know, have not come with a solid proof of his involvement of what happened in America.
9/11?
Except for a video cassette which was given to the Taliban way back before 9/11, that these are the acts that he has committed. And the Taliban returned back to them in a meeting that, do you think under this video, the accusation that you make, is he punishable? And then the American said, no, this is his indictment. He said, the Taliban said, is indictment punishable under your law? The American said, no, it is not. Then how come you expect of us to punish him for something which is not punishable under your law? So narrating this long story is to get your real input, that are you really convinced that Osama did all of what he is accused of?
So, I think the coverage of 9/11, the attack, suffers a little bit from the same problem that Afghanistan has suffered from. I don't know, let me see if I can find it quickly. Just to show you, this is all, just to show you a little bit, I don't know if you can see it well. I think, for example, the orange and the blue is the Afghan voice from Afghanistan and the Western voice. And you think, okay, well, it's a little bit the majority in the New York Times of Western voices, and AP is more. AP has around 10%, 20% more American sources in their coverage. So, but if we talk to the Afghan, the next one, the Afghan voice, then you see that we predominantly talk to Afghans who talk like us. So the Afghan government, who we heavily supported, is green here. So it's a very dominant voice in what has happened in the last 20 years. And so the Omar book is trying to complexify that, right? Try to add much more Afghan sources to it, so the story changes, and sometimes it shows it's factually wrong. Now, on the 9/11, it suffers from the same problem. If you look at the research that has been done, which we did at Sciences Po, to look at what sources have been used when we talk about 9/11, then it's very heavily American. FBI, CIA, American government. And the answer, I see that in the current media landscape, we have lost our audience for 100,000 reasons, but also for this reason. The Western media is losing its audience in a way, not for policymakers, but for the general audience. And many drift off to major questions of like, where is the proof? Huh? And how come it is only an indictment? It's true. It is not the case. It has not been a justice case for Osama bin Laden from the American side. That's an open ending. And I think if you would, maybe, if I would be, if I would do whatever I could with all the money, if I would have a good budget, I would love to reinvestigate the 9/11 properly. not because I don't believe the current narrative, but I see that the narrative suffers from a dominance of white sourcing. And so, in that sense, I think I would love to go into Saudi Arabia, ideally, and to go into the Kuwaiti sources, and to go into the Pakistani sources, and again with the Taliban, to rewrite this story. That is an answer from a journalist to your questions.
Just a little one more on another subject, on the women right in Afghanistan, or the girls' education, which my very respectable senior said, and I do agree with him. But that takes me to another question, that is Afghanistan the only, I'm not the Taliban spokesman, please don't take me that way, but I'm asking a question from like a Taliban will ask you. Is Afghanistan the only country where women are denied their rights? Weren't there countries very close to America or to the West which were denying the same rights to their women, but not a word was said about that? Is the US saying it only to cover for their other faults over there? Or they really are concerned? If they are concerned, then it's not only in Afghanistan, it's in other countries also. They should take it at international level for everybody.
I think, I don't know if you want to open the floor a little bit more, but I think again, I'm a journalist, and from that perspective, I would like to see this critical note more often in the newspaper, saying the US has good relationship with Saudi Arabia, but has problems with the situation in Afghanistan. I don't know how to phrase that sentence now so quickly, but that sort of awareness, that sort of a little bit arm's length towards the American government's policy is necessary. And in that sense, we get the audience back, we get you back, because you're rightly in a sort of different world almost, if you compare it to the newspaper. So, yeah, you're right. The US needs to be called out for this policy towards the Taliban and towards Saudi Arabia on a more structural basis. Yeah.
Ghazala, you had a question?
Yes, thank you for giving the floor to me. I will be asking a very basic question. I'm not Afghanistan. My focus is not on Afghanistan. I mostly work on arms control and disarmament issues. But your account was fascinating for me in the sense that I have not done much work on Afghanistan. So from what I understood was that the Western narrative that has been going around for 20 years and the war on terror and the reality in Afghanistan were quite different. That's what I understood from what you were saying. So, so my question is, how was your book taken in the West mostly? What kind of reactions did you get? Were people in disbelief that, oh, you know, the account we've been told for 20 years is not the one that is actually there on the ground? So a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's not easy to be a Westerner with a book like that. Yeah, and this is the short answer. But there are other books that are on this school of thought, in the sense that, like Anand Gopal, for example, that book is rather widely read. Not so widely as the more mainstream, everything is dangerous in Afghanistan and I'm trying to get refugees out and save the world. I don't know, sorry. But that would be much more a popular book in the US. Now I stereotype a little bit. But yeah, the Omar book has had a difficult moments in finding a publisher, for example, which I describe also in the last chapter of my book. Yeah.
Parva?
Thank you so much, Amna, for giving me the floor. Ma'am, thank you so much for just speaking your heart out and giving us the book that is very much coming from the person who is, I mean, the impression I get from your talk and your work is that of a person who is passionate about knowing the truth and at the same time does not hesitate from sharing it with the world as well. Immense respect and regards. Ma'am, as a student of IR, I'm curious to know more about why truth does not find as much space in Western media as expected, despite unavoidable and glaring evidences. I would like to refer to a book wrote by two American journalists, the editor of the Text Observers, Louis DeBose, and the editor of the Washington Spectator, Jan Brixton, Vice, Dick Cheney, and the hijacking of the American presidency. I would like to share a few pointers which are very disturbing and challenging from the investigation from these two American journalists. The facts were that the Bush administration was hijacked completely by Dick Cheney, and why he harassed the US intelligence officers to wage war on Iraq, how his national energy company, Halliburton, get multi-billion-dollar contracts in military in Iraq, and how, despite eyewitness reports and evidences from Republicans and Democrats, including Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell, the very pillar stone of Bush administration at that time, the truth is still away from public eye. And ma'am, the question I would like to ask again is that why this is not in public media? I mean, why the truth is still away?
What is your job?
My name, sorry ma'am, I just didn't hear.
Here at ISI? Okay,
Yeah.
great. Yeah, I'm not a specialist on all the individuals of the American government under Bush. I think there's quite, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to say. I think there is an overall problem with coverage, and there's a little bit of a closeness between the big media and the US government, and some stories are untold, and that doesn't mean we need to jump into conspiracy immediately, but we need to look at sources. Who is telling us the story? If it's constantly two Americans, one American government and one US think tank, bad journalism. And so just try to read something else. That's what I want to say. And I think you can, on this particular Iraq war situation, I think there has been quite some good research in the sort of like minority narrative that can help you out. Yeah. Yeah.
We'll have one last question and then I'll hand it over to Ambassador Sohail. I think Maheen, but please be quick.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was quite interesting. I have a very small little question, and it's not very academic. I'm more interested in your research and your investigation.
Sure.
What were the highs and lows of your research? Was there any interview that was striking, or any incident that was really difficult to handle? So
right.
That's what I want to know. Thank you.
About incidents that were difficult to handle, less than you expect, I think, less than I expected. I thought this would be a mission impossible almost, but again, one of the messages of the book is that it wasn't. I did it, but other people could have done this job. There could have been 6 biographies on Mullah Omar right now. There was just not enough people who tried. And there were, it was intellectually one of the most, the best moments in my life. Learning about this, I'm a political scientist, so it was fascinating I enriched myself. I mean, I've become a better person because of Afghanistan. And it's sometimes sad because when I fly back, I see the country going down and my career is going up, which is, that feeling. Anyhow, but there's been quite some interviews that were spectacular. For example, I flew into Istanbul to see Taliban And we were picked up by a car without a number plate, and the car drove us around and around and around and around, and I was like, oh God, where am I gonna end? And it turned out that the Panjshiri driver of the Taliban did also not really know Istanbul. So there was no trick behind it to let me disappear in this big city. And then I interviewed him. He had not spoken to anyone. And that was amazing. I think we spoke for 6 hours. And his wife was a friend of the wife of Mullah Omar. And then the next morning, I of course asked, shall we have another round, since I am in Istanbul now? And he's like, yeah, come over. And so, yeah, I had 1.5 days of one of the very close friends of Mullah Omar from the beginning. Yeah, that was, of course, from a journalistic perspective, amazing. Yeah.
Well, I have a quick comment and a question as well. One, I think the great merit of your book lies in the fact that it helps to demystify many aspects of the life of a person which was shrouded in mystery. And some of the key questions and things that you bring out from our perspective in Pakistan is about what you say about the origin of the Taliban movement and the so-called Pakistani connection in that. Then the troubled relationship between Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar. There are, many unproven or things based not too much on facts surrounding this relationship. So if you bring out something more on this aspect. Thirdly, I think the story about the Taliban's surrender, the whole process, and the story getting quashed as quickly as possible because it did not suit the American geostrategic aims at that time. And last but not the least, the last years and the death of Mullah Omar in Zabul. So I hope this book will inspire more research, particularly in Pakistan also. And then some of the themes that you pursue will be further corroborated by evidence, by talking to people. Because we did hear comments that this jury is still out on where he spent his last days and where he died. So you said that you challenged Amrullah Saleh and he hasn't come up with any concrete evidence in support of his claims too. So I think this is very important. My second comment, and which would lead to a question as well, you at the outset said that you had profound dissatisfaction with the quote-unquote master narrative, and you also had reservations with the embedded journalism. And we have seen its many pitfalls and how things are framed and many people have spoken about it, written about it. Noam Chomsky very early on wrote about how some people decide what would be the course in national security and foreign policy, and then the media is used to quote-unquote manufacture consent. And then we have Edward Said also saying how from a particular lens Islam is covered by the Western media and all that. And you have practically experienced in how issues were framed thousands of miles away, and the country's story was made into a caricature, and then nothing was allowed to enter into it, even if the evidence to the contrary also came forth. And you mentioned that you had difficulties in getting the book published as well. I can imagine in the United States perhaps it would be difficult, but you come from Europe, and we can sense that in Europe people are still able to have more nuanced understanding of these issues as compared to their counterparts across the Atlantic. So have you also found resistance within Europe also? You teach at a very prestigious university in France. Does your thesis get resistance from European audiences as well?
I think it was also the book has been received well in the Netherlands. I won an award, Best Investigative Journalist of the Year, but also because they knew me, and I'm Dutch, so there's much more closeness in that relationship. Then the audience, overall, I get sometimes nasty tweets of Dutch people who say, you know, Taliban supporter. Of course I get that, from all over the world. That's sad, but yeah, that happens. On the other hand, also European Union we have, of course, in Brussels, is a player here. I think that was a very disappointing interaction with them over the 20 years. Yeah, they have been very much leaning into towards the US narrative and very reluctant to speak really out loud against it or take a different route in that sense. So that is another audience. And at the same time, for me, thinking about the audience, I also automatically think about the American audience because it's just the most powerful player. See, and and that in a way, I'm also. I would love to see if in the future if I could have talks to them, talks to the New York Times about this problem, and who knows, something will change. I don't know. I'm less and less optimistic. But I find the outcomes of this, I find it dangerous for conflict. I find it dangerous to consider, you know, the Ukraine war. How do we cover that right now? And I think we should really, as journalists, come together, because I feel like there's a lot of will in journalism, among correspondents. I get a lot of confirmation of the problem that I introduce, of the white bias. So yeah, I think it's time to really, also in the time of like Black Lives Matter and racism and diversity, I think this is the time that we need to become global journalists and not really like constantly referring to our own parliaments, that where nation states are so powerful. And yeah, anyhow, was that an answer?
All right, so I think it's been a very interesting and exhaustive session for Bette. If we don't have any more questions, I will just like to express my gratitude to you. Thank you so much for coming. It's really been interesting, and I think I encourage everybody to read or get a copy of the book. It's available in Said Book Bank, I believe, because it gives an account, as everybody has said now, of what a lot of us already knew. But I think the fact that it's coming from a Western author, honestly,
it's also sad news.
It is sad. It is. It's extremely upsetting. But I think it, in some way, pacifies the voices on our side, you know, of the region. It does, because this is something that I think many of us have been saying. But again, it comes to how much credibility revolves around it, and this I think we've discussed today. I look forward to your new work. You know, and hopefully in a couple of months that'll be out, and we would love to have you again and host you. So on behalf of Cami and ISIS, I thank you once again. And a round of applause for Ms. Bette Dam, please. I believe as a small token of appreciation, we have a shield from the Institute that Ambassador Khalid Mahmood will present, please.